Hello, Dr. A here, and we're going to go over water, electrolyte, and acid-base balance. All right, so this is going to be very logical, but to be in balance, the quantities of fluid and electrolytes are molecules that release ions in water. Those molecules leaving the body should be equal to the amounts taken in. Well, that's just a revelation now, isn't it? Anything that alters the concentration of electrolytes will also alter the concentration of water and vice versa. And part of that, of course, is because the electrolytes are dissolved in water, right? So the body requires mechanisms to replace lost water and lost electrolytes, but also to get rid of any excess. So let's look at how body fluids are distributed around the body. So fluids occur in what we call compartments in the body. And the movement of water and electrolytes between these compartments is regulated. The average adult female is 52% water by weight, while a male is 63% water. The female has more adipose tissue, the male has more muscle tissue, and muscle tissue holds more water. And if you want, as a side note, that is also why males tend to be able to tolerate alcohol better because they basically have more body water to dissolve it in than females. The intracellular fluid compartment includes all the water and electrolytes within the cells. So inside the cells, intracellular. So if you could measure the volume in each cell and put it all together, that would be actually the biggest compartment, the biggest fluid compartment. So that's 63% by volume. The extracellular fluid compartment includes all water and electrolytes that are outside of the cells. This includes interstitial fluid, which is the fluid between the cells, plasma, and lymph, and that is 37% by volume. And then you have transcellular fluid, which is a type of extracellular fluid, but it includes cerebrospinal fluid in the central nervous system, the fluids in the eyeball, the synovial fluids in the joints, the serous fluids within body cavities like the pleural fluid and pericardial fluid and stuff, and your exocrine gland secretions. So think digestive enzymes in the process of digestion, and all of these things are secreted by your exocrine glands in sweat and saliva, or actually also from exocrine glands. Okay, so quick little recall. Most of the water in your body is located where? In your blood as plasma. It is inside your cells. Is it in interstitial fluid, or is it spinal fluid? So hopefully you caught this and paid attention. But inside the cells, so intracellular fluid is the biggest compartment of your total body water. So it is basically, just remember, it's about 2/3 to 1/3. So. I mean, 63%, 37%, about, right? And then within the extracellular fluid, the most abundant there is going to be your interstitial fluid. So it's all the fluid that's around your cells. Then you have plasma, so that's the liquid portion of blood. Lymph, the lymphatic fluid, which is, basically a filtrated plasma, kind of. And then you have your transcellular fluid, which we already just mentioned. So let's look at body fluid composition. So what's in these body fluids, especially in the different body compartments? Because their makeup is not the same. So extracellular fluids, so that's your interstitial fluid, your plasma, your lymph, have high concentrations of sodium and chloride and bicarb, and then less of potassium, calcium, magnesium, phosphate, and sulfate. So if you look in this graph here, your extracellular fluid is in this blue-green color. So this is sodium, and so you see the peak of sodium, like how much, 140 plus milliequivalents per liter, and that's an average reading for a blood value of sodium. But that's also what's in lymphatic fluid and what's in interstitial fluids. Lots of sodium, lots of chlorides, and the reading for chlorides usually a little bit above 100. So those are the two biggest components of salt, sodium chloride. are the two biggest component of plasma and interstitial fluid, with bicarb right here, the next most abundant thing in plasma and interstitial fluid and stuff. And then if you look inside of the cells, the positive ion that's in abundance inside the cell is potassium, almost as much as there is sodium on the outside. So all your potassium in your body really lives in your cells. There is some in plasma, but it's just little. So your values for potassium in your plasma are like around 3-4 milliequivalents per liter. They're really small. And there's very little sodium inside the cell. So there's a whole bunch of potassium. There's also a whole bunch of magnesium. That's another positive ion, with a bunch of phosphorus in there too. Okay, and there is some bicarb, but there's more bicarb in your extracellular fluid. So again, intracellular fluid has a lot of potassium, phosphate, and mag, but then less sodium, chloride, and bicarb. But then altogether, the positives and the negatives on the in both do equal each other. Okay, so where would you find the most sodium and chloride? Would it be inside your cells, or would it be in plasma and interstitial fluid? Where would you find the most potassium and magnesium? Would it be inside your cells, or would it be in plasma and interstitial fluid? And bicarb is important to acid-base balance, which we're going to see here in a little bit. And so where do you have the most bicarb? Is it inside your cells, or is it in plasma and interstitial fluid? So answer those questions. So let's talk about movement of fluid between these compartments. So we've already hinted at that when we looked at the cardiovascular system, and when we were looking at fluid moving from the capillaries into the tissue bed, and then returning to some of it being pulled back to the venous end, some of it going into the lymphatic system. And so hydrostatic pressure and osmotic pressure are the two pressures that will regulate the movement of water and electrolytes from one compartment to the other. So that would be from the plasma to the interstitial, from interstitial to inside the cells. Okay. And although the composition of body fluids varies from one compartment to another, the total solute concentrations and water amounts are normally equal. So let's just use some fictional percentages, but let's say you had 40% solutes and 60% water on each side. That would be the same. So you would have inside the cell, you'd have 40% solute and 60% water, and outside the cell you would have 40% solute and 60% water. The difference is the solutes are not the same, right? Inside the cell, your solute is going to be your potassium and your magnesium and stuff. And outside of the cell, your solute is going to be your sodium and chloride and stuff. But their relative abundance is the same, right? So a net gain or loss of water can cause shift that affect both intra and extracellular fluids due to changes in osmotic pressure. So this is, again, the way we have membranes separating all of these compartments. So you have your endothelial capillary lining that separates plasma from interstitial, and then you have your cell membrane that separates interstitial from intracellular. Okay, and osmosis is the way water moves through these membranes. Okay, so if ideally the percentage is the same on both sides, right? So the solute concentration is the same on both sides. So the water movement should be equal and should cancel each other out pretty much. But for example, if you had lost water through sweating and it pulled it from your cells and your interstitial fluid, so it dropped the water percentage, so maybe you went from 60 to 50% or something like that, so made it more, the solute being more in relationship to the water, then what's going to happen is the intracellular and interstitial compartments will pull from plasma some, and so it will try to equal everything out. So their stuff is always shifting back and forth between all of these compartments, and water can move back and forth, but obviously the electrolytes can move also. Okay, so next question. True, false? Under normal circumstances, the solute concentration in plasma is the same as that of intracellular fluids. So answer true, false on that. And so again, here it is illustrated. So the couple of membranes that separate these different compartments and do allow fluid and electrolytes and things to move through are your capillary wall, so the endothelial layer of your capillary wall. Water and electrolytes and things move out of the capillaries into the interstitial fluid. Some of it is going to get pulled back into the capillaries through osmosis, because as water leaves, then it shifts the balance, and so we may pull some back in to kind of try to restore some balance. And then once it's interstitial fluid, it can become transcellular fluid. So if you need some joint fluid, or if you need some eyeball fluid, or some spinal fluid, or something like that, it will pull it from your interstitial fluid. And it will also put it, of course, in all your cells, intracellular, and then also anything left that did not make it back in here is going to enter the lymphatic system and eventually be returned to the venous circulation. So one thing I learned I thought was interesting, and I mentioned here, is generally speaking, if you're chronically dehydrated, one of the fluids that's the lowest priority for your body is joint fluid. And so you may have more joint aches and more deterioration of the joints just due to the lack of fluid that's present there, and therefore, lack of enough synovial fluid to lubricate it, and so it causes more like wearing and grinding and stuff like that. I just thought that was interesting. Okay, so let's first talk about water balance. So water balance exists when the water intake equals the water output. So water intake is the volume of water gained each day. It does vary from one individual to the next. That depends on your habits, how much you drink. By the way, if you're like a big coffee drinker or a big caffeine drinker, you are probably dehydrating yourself, because it's a diuretic. And basically for every like 8 ounces of coffee that you drink, you need at least 8 ounces of water just to replace what you lost. And that just means that just puts you at zero. So you haven't really hydrated yourself. So you need to almost drink double the amount of water as you do caffeine or caffeinated drinks in order to not be dehydrated. So about 60% of your daily water is going to be from drinking, ideally, again, drinking non-caffeinated drinks. Another 30% will come from moist foods, so think fruits and vegetables, and most of the foods have some moisture level to them. And then 10% from the water of metabolism. So if you go back and look in Anatomy 1 in your chemistry chapter and all of that, the chemical reactions that occur in your body not only occur in water, but they can also produce water. And so when you join molecules together, water is actually produced. And when you join amino acids together, when you join glucoses together, fatty acids together, and all of that. And so that is the water metabolism, and it is 10% of your water volume. So it is significant enough. So water intake, the primary regulator of water intake is thirst, which is a mechanism from your central nervous system that drives you to drink water, hopefully, or just drink something liquid. The thirst center is in the hypothalamus, so in the diencephalon, so in the center of your brain. And the thirst mechanism derives from the osmotic pressure or of the extracellular fluids and the changes detected by these osmoreceptors. So the fluid in your brain is, it's an extracellular fluid. It's sensing how concentrated it is, what solute to water concentration there is. And if it seems a little too concentrated, so then that signals that you are dehydrated and you need more water to dilute it back to normal. And so it will trigger the the osmoreceptors to trigger a signal of thirst in the hypothalamus and drive the behavior of seeking water or seeking something to drink. So, which one will trigger the osmoreceptors to activate the thirst mechanism? Would it be a decrease in plasma osmolarity or an increase in plasma osmolarity? All right, so the plasma or osmolarity then being the, average solute concentration in a solution. The solution is your extracellular fluid. Okay, so water output. So the water is lost in urine, feces, sensible perspiration. So that's perspiration that you can feel, right? That's sweat. So that's you make an effort, working hard, being outside in current temperatures in the summer in the south, right? Sweat, or evaporation from skin. That's insensible perspiration. So just being alive, you're always like putting off a little bit of water. Um, if you're not aware of that, then in combination with the water that exits you from the lungs during breathing, sit in a car in the wintertime and see how fast it becomes fogged up. Why does it come fogged up? It's because you yourself are putting off insensible perspiration, so water is evaporating from your skin, but also you're breathing it out from your lungs. So the route of water loss tends to depend on the temperature. Is it cold outside? Is it hot outside? Obviously, when we have really hot summer days, especially even with high humidity and stuff like that, you will lose water quite quickly. So the relative humidity does factor in also in physical exercise. So even a dry heat can cause you to lose a lot of water pretty quickly too. So regulation of water output, you have obviously urine production. That's what we just covered in a previous chapter. So if you remember, the distal convoluted tubules of the nephrons and the collecting ducts can regulate water output because that is where antidiuretic hormone can act. So the antidiuretic hormone comes from the posterior pituitary. And it causes a reduction in the amount of water loss in the urine. And it is triggered by the same signal in the hypothalamus that triggers thirst will also trigger the release of antidiuretic hormone. So antidiuretic, if you want to remember what its action is, think of a diuretic, like I just mentioned, like coffee and tea are diuretics. They make you pee, so they make you lose water. So an antidiuretic hormone makes you not lose water, right? So what it does is the antidiuretic hormone at the level of those collecting ducts and distal convoluted tubules will cause, if antidiuretic hormone is secreted and arrives there at the kidneys in the nephron, it will cause aquaporins to be formed and inserted though in that area of the distal convoluted tubules and the collecting ducts, and the aquaporins will allow water to flow from the urine back into the blood, and therefore putting water back into the blood, just water, which then dilutes it back and hopefully helps kind of hydrate you again. But ideally, you should drink enough water. If you drink enough water so that you're well hydrated, that antidiuretic mechanism is going to be inhibited, and then you will pee more water out into the urine. If you wonder whether or not you are hydrated enough, then basically the idea is if you're hydrated enough and without you taking in caffeinated drinks. This caffeinated drinks again are going to make you pee a lot, so you may have a lot of dilute urine. But when you first get up in the morning, if your urine is really, really concentrated, you're probably chronically dehydrated. And if you have really dark or really concentrated urines, you're probably chronically dehydrated. Your urine should be really clear, maybe a very light yellow color if you are adequately hydrated. Okay, so drinking plenty of water would cause ADH secretion from the posterior pituitary, or would it cause ADH secretion suppression in the posterior pituitary? Which one is it? Okay, so again, illustrated. Again, intake should equal output. About 2.5 liters is average. 10% is water of metabolism. 30% is moist foods, and then 60% should be beverages. For the output, about was 6% or so is water lost in sweat. What is it? 8%. I can hardly see the graphic here. Then water lost in feces, water lost through the skin and the lungs is quite a bit. It's almost 30%. And water lost in urine would be pretty much equal to what you're taking in beverages, which incidentally, if you decide all of a sudden, like, okay, I'm not drinking enough water, I'm going to start drinking a bunch of water, I would go at it gradually. So maybe if you only drink like 1 bottle of water a day, then try drinking 2. And then after a few days, try drinking 3. And then don't go from 1 to like 6 or something like that, because what's going to happen is you're going to spend all your time in the bathroom because your body hasn't adapted, and this is going to kind of just flush it out. So just up your intake gradually if you want to up your water consumption. Okay, so next let's talk electrolyte balance. So an electrolyte balance will exist when the quantities of electrolytes gained equals the amount lost. Same principle. So electrolyte intake, where do we get them from? So first of all, the ones that are really, really important to cellular metabolism are sodium, potassium, calcium, magnesium, chloride, sulfate, phosphate, bicarb, and hydrogen ions. And where do we get them? Usually from food or drink, or they can be produced as a byproduct of metabolism. Some of it, though, I've learned over the years is that we just don't have enough of some of these minerals and stuff in our food. And so magnesium is one especially, and it has to do with the way we cultivate our food and farming practices and stuff that's put into the soil or not added back into the soil and stuff. And so our food does not have as much magnesium, especially our vegetables and all that, as it did, way back. And so I've actually personally started just taking a magnesium supplement. I take usually a magnesium that's chelated to an amino acid like a mag citrate or mag aspartate or mag glycinate or something like that. And one of the signs and symptoms if you don't have enough magnesium, it would be a lot of anxiety, trouble sleeping, just those are the 2 big ones, like muscle cramps and stuff too, but really anxiety and trouble sleeping, maybe memory problems, it's really important. Magnesium is quite important. So, the regulation of electrolyte intake. So a person normally will get enough electrolytes from foods eaten and beverages. But if you have a salt craving, it may indicate an electrolyte deficiency. There's also a pretty neat theory out there, backed by a lot of science and research, that says that also chronically high blood pressure could be due to not enough of the right kind of salt in your diet. And so it's a book. There's a book called The Salt Fix, which is really interesting if you're interested in that topic. Okay, what is a good way to ensure enough electrolytes and water hydration are available when you are active outdoors in the heat? So that's quite relevant for being right in the middle of summer, right, in the South. So if you're in the summer in the South and you're outside, how can you make sure that you have enough electrolytes and water available? It's a pretty simple answer. Okay, so electrolyte outputs. So we lose electrolyte through sweating, we lose it in feces, and we lose it in urine. So sweating is obvious, especially if you're working again out in the summer, and so you need to take precautions to replenish them quite well. So I'm not sure what you answered in the previous one, but I would say my top favorites for that are going to be coconut water, which not everybody likes, but it's really good to replenish those electrolytes. Pickle juice is another one, or eating pickles. That's another really good one. And then after that, then all the commercial electrolyte drinks and stuff like that. If you have really bad bouts of diarrhea, you could very well become dehydrated because of loss of electrolytes and stuff. And so if you're having diarrhea, it's also important to replenish electrolytes. If you have a kid, usually you give them Pedialyte, which are pediatric electrolytes, but you should do the same for yourself as an adult. So, regulation of electrolyte output. The concentrations of sodium, potassium, and calcium are very important. So, sodium ions will account for 90% of the positively charged ions in your extracellular fluids, such as plasma. And aldosterone is the hormone that regulates sodium reabsorption in the renal tubule. So again, you can go back to the previous chapter to go back and review about that. But aldosterone is produced by the adrenal glands. It causes you to reclaim sodium. So in case you don't have enough sodium in your blood, you will reclaim sodium from the urine. And every time you move sodium back into the blood, because you need more because you don't have enough, water follows. And that is how not having enough sodium in your diet can cause high blood pressure. And then every time it does that and reabsorbs the sodium, puts it in the blood, it has to take a potassium from the blood and dump it out. So people that have low potassium levels will tend to have a lot of muscle cramps and stuff. So aldosterone also regulates your potassium ions. So potassium ions are excreted when sodium ions are conserved. So it has to trade. It has to trade one for the other. And so the one that it dumps is potassium. Normally though, you can have enough potassium in your diet to counter that, but certain medications may alter that, or if, again, you're chronically dehydrated or chronically low in sodium, that could be a problem for your potassium also. Your calcium concentrations are regulated by your parathyroid hormone, which will increase the concentration of calcium in the blood, right? In extracellular fluids, which is blood and plasma. So it'll not only drive calcium, but also phosphate into the blood. And calcitonin, which removes excess calcium from the blood and puts it into bone. So parathyroid hormone and calcitonin have opposite effect on blood calcium levels. Generally, the regulatory mechanisms that control positively charged ions will control your negatively charged ion in a secondary manner, meaning that when the positive one moves, the negative one follows. So wherever you move, sodium chloride follows. Sodium chloride is salt. There you go. And other than that, you have active transport with limited transport capacity can regulate phosphate and sulfate ions. So that active transport means it expends ATP and it moves it with purpose into a certain compartment or another because it is needed in that compartment. All right, next questions. If someone is chronically dehydrated, their body's always producing aldosterone to reclaim sodium in water, what would you expect their plasma potassium to be? Would it be high or would it be low? And which of these is a fluid imbalance disorder? So again, this is kind of general knowledge. What do you think? Would it be dehydration, edema, both, or neither of them? And by the way, the answer is they both are. So both dehydration and edema are fluid disorders, or fluid imbalances. Okay, so let's dive into acid-base balance. So again, I'm going to give you kind of general governing principles of acid-base balance. If you are going into nursing, you're going to deal with this, especially if you go into ER or critical care, and even in surgery and stuff like that too. And if you go in respiratory therapy, you're going to deal with acid-base balance too, because part of it is controlled by the respiratory system. So electrolytes that ionize in water and release hydrogen ions are acids. So if they can produce hydrogen ions, they're considered an acid. And any electrolyte that can combine with a hydrogen ion is a base. And the maintenance of homeostasis or balance in the body, right, depends on the control of your acids and bases in body fluids. So you don't want too much of either one. There's a perfect balance, and we try to maintain that perfect balance. The source of hydrogen ions, which is usually what can throw the balance off, so it's having either too much or maybe sometimes not enough of hydrogen ions. Most hydrogen ions will originate as byproducts of metabolic processes. Some of those are the aerobic respiration of glucose, so turning glucose into ATP makes carbonic acid. Anaerobic respiration of glucose, So also turning glucose into ATP, but without using oxygen, that makes lactic acid, which makes your muscles sore and all that. The incomplete oxidation of fatty acids, so if you're burning fatty acids instead of glucose for fuel, can make your some acidic ketone bodies. The oxidation of sulfur-containing amino acids will make sulfuric acid, and hydrolysis of your phosphoproteins and nucleic acids will make phosphoric acid. So your phosphoproteins are and nucleic acids are part of your cells. Nucleic acids are your DNA and RNA and all of that. So all of those things can dump excess hydrogen ions into the environment. And I would say usually when disease processes come up, it's more likely for you to have an excess of acids than it is for you to have an excess of bases. But either one can happen. All right, a little bit on the strengths of acids and bases, because that's a concept that's comes up sometimes. So an acid that ionizes more completely are strong acids, and those that ionize less completely are weak acids. So whether they give up all their hydrogen ions all at once really quickly, that would be a strong, or just a little bit, that would be a weak one. And bases that release hydroxide and bicarb ions, both of which can combine with your hydrogen ions, thereby they lower their concentration. So again, the bases they're bases because they can pick up those hydrogen ions. So how do we regulate those hydrogen ion concentration? There's several ways. There's the chemical buffer systems, which we're going to look at, the respiratory center in the brainstem, so through different regulation of breathing, and then the kidneys can regulate the pH of body fluids, and they also have a role because they can choose to either dump excess hydrogen ions, retain some if there's not enough, dump bicarb or retain bicarb. So it can work quite well on both the acidic and the base side of things. So let's look at the chemical buffer systems first. So these are quite important. So the basic components of a buffer can combine with the strong acids and convert it to a weaker one, or the acid components combine with a strong base to make a weaker one. And so they are all illustrated here. And so there's always two components to a chemical buffer system. There's the half that will make something too acidic back more to more neutral, and the half that makes something that's too basic back more to neutral. And so the chemical buffer systems are the bicarb buffer system, the phosphate buffer system, and the protein buffer system. So your bicarb, you have your bicarbonate ion here, and so it can pick up hydrogen ions, and therefore in the presence of excess acid, and therefore lower the acid content and raise the pH. The carbonic acid is an acid, so it can donate or release a hydrogen ion in the presence of excess base and bring the pH back down. The phosphate system, so we have monohydrogen phosphate ion. It can pick up a hydrogen ion just like bicarb can, and then dihydrogen phosphate ion can give a hydrogen ion just like carbonic acid can, right? So same effect on the pH. And then your protein system, so in amino acids, in hemoglobin is in there, and hemoglobin is a major buffer in your blood. So on every protein, you should have learned this in Anatomy 1, you have an amino group and a carboxyl group. So the amino group of the amino acid or protein can pick up a hydrogen and become NH3 from NH2 in the presence of excess acid. And the carboxyl group can donate this hydrogen ion right here in the presence of excess base. And both of these are present on proteins. So proteins automatically, they can help adjust because they have both solutions on them. Okay, next question. So the buffering capacity of hemoglobin, as I mentioned, would be part of which of these buffer systems? The bicarb one, the phosphate one, the protein one, or none of those? Okay, so this is for a respiratory therapist, but also for you guys that are going to be doing ICU and stuff. So one of the ways the body can maintain acid-base balance is through the respiratory excretion of carbon dioxide. So we look in the respiratory chapter, we breathe out carbon dioxide, right? And so you have too much carbon dioxide accumulating, you just breathe it out more. Okay, so the respiratory center in your brainstem helps to regulate the hydrogen ion concentration by controlling the rate and depth of breathing. So, for example, during exercise, your carbon dioxide is going to build up. Why is it building up? Because you're burning through a bunch of ATP. You're having to make ATP and all of that. So you're using more oxygen, right? So you're starting to breathe faster. But part of why you're breathing faster is because you're using up more oxygen making ATP, which creates more carbon dioxide. That raises the amount of carbon dioxide in your blood, which releases excess hydrogen ions, which makes your blood more acidic, which triggers your brain's breathing control center to breathe more and deeper to get that CO2 out. Because as you get the CO2 out, you'll get rid of the hydrogen ions and stuff like that. So, again, that's why you breathe more when you exercise and make big efforts. So basically, your cells increase the production of CO2 because your metabolism has gone up because you're exercising or running or doing something. CO2 reacts with water, makes carbonic acid. Carbonic acid releases a hydrogen ion that stimulates the respiratory center. It increases rates and depth of breathing, and then it goes back the other way, and it is going to go. Carbonic acid will become excess CO2 at the lungs, which can be breathed out. Okay, so name a process in the body that would create excess CO2 other than exercise. So just think CO2 is tied to metabolism. So what can cause increased metabolism, if you will? Okay, so renal excretion of hydrogen ions is another way, again, we can maintain acid-base balance. So your kidneys can excrete hydrogen ions, and they usually do that in the distal convoluted tubule. So your nephrons can excrete any excess hydrogen ions in the urine. It's just it takes a little bit longer for this to kick in and to happen effectively. The time course of hydrogen ion regulation. So first, your chemical buffers are always the first line of defense against any kind of shifts in pH. Okay. Then your physiological buffer systems, which are your respiratory and your renal mechanisms, they function a little bit more slowly and constitute your secondary defenses. Okay. So if you start breathing hard and all that, it's because you've kind of gone past what your chemical buffer system can do just on their own. And of the two, the respiratory is the fastest and the renal is going to be the slowest. So again, both the chemical and the physiological buffer systems usually keep your body fluids within very narrow pH ranges, but abnormal conditions could prevent this and could cause shifts in the pH. So what do we mean by narrow range and what is normal? So ideal normal pH is 7.4. We have a little bit of wiggle room, but not a lot. So the wiggle room is 7.35 to 7.45. That's it. That is considered normal. Your body is going to do everything it can to keep the blood pH between these two numbers, okay? Anything below 7.35 is going to be acidic. It's going to be an acidosis, a condition of too much acidity. And anything above 7.45 is going to be alkalosis, or a condition of being too alkaline, which is the same as being too basic. So too much base, too much alkaline is the same thing, right? So, all right, below this is acidosis, above that is alkalosis. What you will see the most in your critical patients is going to be acidosis. All right, next question. So if your patient's pH is shifting into acidosis, less than 7.35, so what would that mean? Does it mean that the chemical buffers are not working as much as needed, but respiratory and renal mechanisms are working good? It means the respiratory and renal mechanisms are not working as much as needed, but the chemical buffers are. It means that both the chemical buffers and the respiratory renal mechanisms are not working well. In D, everything is fine. So don't pick D. If you're in acidosis, everything is not fine. Okay, so this graph really recaps all the ways things can go wrong with acid-base balance in the body. So our target is 7.4. Okay, so how can we go into acidosis? How does this drop? How does these things go around? Generally speaking, it's going to be because of an increased concentration of hydrogen ions, and that is going to be either because we have too many acids that have accumulated or we've lost too many of the bases. So this, because the loss of base, it gives you a relative increase of hydrogen ions, but it still drops the pH, okay, because they need to be in balance. And accumulation of acids, if you go back a few slides ago on all the sources of hydrogen ions, that was in aerobic metabolism, anaerobic metabolism, ketosis, etc. Okay. What can cause it to go too high, go to alkalosis, is a decreased concentration of these hydrogen ions. So either you have too many bases accumulating or you lost too many acids. Okay. So those are basically the four mechanisms that can cause things to go wrong in acid-base balance. Okay, so let's first talk about acidosis. So when the pH drops. Within acidosis, there are two ways things can go wrong. There's respiratory acidosis, and then we're going to look at metabolic acidosis. So respiratory acidosis will result from an increase in carbonic acid that is caused by either respiratory center injury, air passage obstruction, or disease process that decrease gas exchange. All of those basically cause too much CO2 to accumulate in the body. So let's think, respiratory center injury. That could be, for example, they overdose on downers that depress the central nervous system. That's if you will, that's a respiratory center injury, or trauma to the head or something like that, right? Air passage obstruction. Somebody is strangled or somebody chokes on an object or something, and then all of a sudden air can't move, right? A disease process that decreases gas exchange. COPD is a big one, with emphysema and chronic bronchitis being the two top COPD. Because of the damage to the lungs, the gas exchange is altered to where there's not enough oxygen going in and not enough CO2 leaving. So first, what will happen is the chemical buffers are gonna kick in, and we're gonna have an increased rate and depth of breathing, and then the kidneys are going to try to excrete the acid to try to return the pH to normal. All of these processes, the activation of the chemical buffers, the increasing rate and depth of breathing, and the kidney excretion of the acids, are all mechanisms of compensation. So we're trying to compensate for what's going wrong and maintain the pH the closest to normal. If your pH is still in that normal range, but some of the parameters that you can measure are off, like you have too much CO2 or not enough bicarb or something like that, then you could still have an acid-base imbalance, but it's compensated. Once the pH shifts, then it's no longer compensated. So symptoms result usually from depressed central nervous system. So you could get drowsiness, disorientation, stupor, labor breathing, cyanosis, and they can lead to coma and death. So a lot of these symptoms are all due to too much CO2. Okay, so again, either a decreased rate and depth of breathing, obstruction of air passages, or a decreased gas exchange can all cause an accumulation of CO2. CO2 accumulates, causes all these signs and symptoms, and you also go into respiratory acidosis. So this is where our respiratory therapists would come in. They would secure the airway. They would initiate some of the gas exchange with ventilation and stuff, try to pull some of the CO2 off. There's all kinds of different ways that you can do that, but basically, usually when there's a decreased rate and depth of breathing, they're just not breathing enough on their own. Okay. Obviously, if there's obstruction in the air passages, the ideal is you remove the obstruction and then you can ventilate them. So the other type of acidosis is metabolic acidosis. So metabolic acidosis can be due to either an accumulation of acids or a loss of bases, but it doesn't have anything to do with the CO2. Okay. So it has many, many causes, including kidney disease. So if your kidneys are damaged and stuff, and they can't excrete those acids or retain bases and stuff like that, then they can be a problem. Vomiting, diarrhea, and diabetes mellitus. So especially type 1 diabetes is very prone to metabolic acidosis. With vomiting and diarrhea, you can either basically lose too much of your bases with the stuff moving out of your body. So if you remember, your pancreatic secretions do secrete a fluid-rich in bicarb, which is a base. So your chemical buffers will kick in. They will also increase the respiratory rate, or the amount of hydrogen ions released by the kidneys can help all compensate for acidosis. So the kidneys will attempt to dump the excess hydrogen ions, and the respiratory rate will also increase, just like when you have an increase in CO2. But what's happening here is the increase of the hydrogen ions is driving the increase in CO2, is being converted to CO2 to try to get rid of it through excretion of CO2. But it's not that you're trapping CO2 or anything like that in the system. It's just that you're making way too many hydrogen ions, and the body's got to do something with it. And so one of the things it can do with that excess hydrogen ion is make it into CO2 via carbonic acid and get rid of it through the lungs. So in metabolic acidosis, you can have, for example, the kidney is failing to excrete acid. So this can happen in kidney failure, right? So then that accumulates what we call non-respiratory acids, so non-CO2 acids accumulate here, and that causes metabolic acid. Or you can have an excessive production of ketones, such as in diabetes mellitus. So in type 1 diabetes mellitus, if they don't have the insulin present, they can't burn glucose. If they can't burn glucose, they have to burn fat. If they burn fat, they produce ketones. And if they produce too many ketones, they will go into acidosis. And then you could also potentially lose too much of your bases in relationship to your acids. So prolonged diarrhea with loss of the alkaline intestinal secretions will cause a loss of the bases, and prolonged vomiting with also a loss of those intestinal secretions. So you have the same kind of loss, it's just it's coming out of one end or the other, right? And that causes an excessive loss of bases. So that means that in relationship to the amount of bases, you have too much acids, and it causes a metabolic acidosis. So then alkalosis, which can happen, but you'll see it less frequently. So alkalosis is too much, it's too alkaline, it's too many bases. So respiratory alkalosis will result from hyperventilation because you have an excessive loss of carbon dioxide. So again, because it's respiratory, the element that goes wrong is the carbon dioxide, but instead of having too much, you have too little. And you have too little because you breathed out too much of it. So a panic attack is a good illustration of that, where because of anxiety or something like that, somebody has a panic attack, they can start hyperventilating because of an emotional component, and the fact that they're hyperventilating will cause their CO2 to drop. Their symptoms are going to be lightheadedness, agitation, dizziness, tingling sensations, and tetanic muscle contractions, which are like drawing muscle contractions. And so, of course, addressing what's causing the panic attack and all of that, and trying to get out of hyperventilation is what you want. So my daughter has panic attacks, my oldest one, and I've taught her box breathing to counter that, and it works really, really well. And it's where you breathe in to a count of 5 and then hold it to a count of 5. So hold your full breath, right, to a count of 5. Breathe out to a count of 5, and then hold your empty breath to a count of 5. And you do quite a few boxes, as many as you can, and it can pull you out of hyperventilation and out of panic attack mode and stuff. But the idea of breathing in a paper bag can help with a patient that's hyperventilating, because it allows them to rebreathe their CO2 and not lose as much of it. And then the metabolic alkalosis would be caused by a great loss of hydrogen ions or from a gain of bases. So You could lose also too much hydrogen ions also from vomiting if you're losing too much stomach acid. So stomach acid is an acid, so you lose too much of the stomach acid. That could cause an excess loss of your hydrogen ions. Or the use of certain drugs, diuretics, or antacids. So antacids are a base. If you're crunching on antacids all the time and you overdo the antacids, you could cause alkalosis in your blood because you have excess amount of bases that you're taking in. So the symptom of a metabolic alkalosis will always be a decrease in breathing rate and depth. So your breathing becomes more shallow. And the compensation for alkalosis, again, the chemical buffers are going to kick in, like hemoglobin releases some excess hydrogen ions. There will be decreased respiration, whereas in the other one, acidosis was increased respiration. This time it's going to be decreased respiration. Why? Why would we decrease respiration? Because we want to keep the CO2, because the CO2 can be made into carbonic acid, which is an acid, and we don't have enough of the acids, right? So we decrease the respiration. And then the kidneys can decrease that excretion of hydrogen ions and actually increase the excretion of those bicarbonate ions. So it can dump the bases instead of dumping the acids. Okay, so this is the last one illustrated. So there's anxiety, fever, poisoning, or high altitude, which all could cause hyperventilation. And that causes an excessive loss of CO2 and a decrease in concentration of carbonic acid and a decrease in concentration of hydrogen ions, and that leads to respiratory alkalosis. And I forgot to put my last slide if you have any questions, so just message me if you have any questions on this lesson, and that is the last slide and the end of the lesson. Thank you for your attention.